Professor Kate Masur from Northwestern University. I love your area of research and study, and this gets me so excited for this Friday class. Her work really looks closely at how Americans grappled with race and equality in the 19th century after the 13th Amendment. And really understand this conversation around the 14th Amendment, around equality, and around race. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our other professor, Professor Jeffrey Rosen, who is the head and CEO of the National Constitution Center. Jeff, would you like to take it from here?
Thank you so much, Curry. And Professor Masur, we are really excited to have you. And I think we should just jump in with the subject of your new book, Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction. Tell us about the argument of the book and your exploration of the battle for equal rights in the decades before the Civil War.
Well, thanks so much. It's great to be here. And so I'll just jump right in on that. So when I have traditionally, I've written a lot about the Civil War and Reconstruction. And when I was finishing up my book on Washington, D.C. during that period, I started wondering, where did the ideas that ended up in the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is the nation's first federal civil rights law, where did those ideas even come from? And, I think an easy answer would be to say, well, a lot of those ideas were from the ideas of equality in the Declaration of Independence. They were from sort of general ideas about that people should be equal, that people should have certain rights enforced. But I wanted to know how it was that people came into government in the 1860s and wanted to put those ideas into practice and even into the United States Constitution. And I looked at that and I thought about how one thing that many people don't often talk about is the North in the antebellum period before the Civil War was also a post-slavery society. And so, slavery had existed in New York and in Pennsylvania, all over the places that were basically the colonies, including the northern colonies before the American Revolution. And so I wondered about the extent to which Americans in the northern states had fought over the same questions of race and rights and equality that were then on the table nationally during the Civil War and Reconstruction. And I went and investigated that question and ended up finding, yes, there was this long-standing debate, oftentimes in constitutional terms, about questions of race and equality, sometimes about the United States Constitution, but also very often at the state level, because there were so few provisions to enforce rights at the national level. And so that was the impetus for this book. And it makes an argument that over the course of many decades, people involved in social movements, African Americans, white Americans, came together to make arguments about the significance of racial equality before the law. And they pursued these policies in their states and at the federal level. And they weren't able to make very much progress, particularly at the federal level, until the Civil War made that possible. But when the war came about, they were poised to do certain things because they had already hashed out a lot of these arguments in the pre-Civil War North. And so that's where I kind of went with the book. And I'm looking forward to having it out there in the world.
So exciting. We can't wait to read it. And once it is out there, we'd love to host programs at the NCC. A few more questions before I open it up to our friends. Tell us about the constitutional principles that were being debated and whether in those state constitutions or in the debates before the Civil War, we find terms like privileges or immunities or equal protection or due process or the provisions that ended up in the 14th Amendment. I'll show you now. I don't know if you've seen the latest version of the interactive Constitution, but we have online this amazing platform called the drafting table, which has early drafts of each of the major provisions of the 14th Amendment, including, of course, Bingham's. So Stevens is proposing racial equality. All laws shall operate impartially. And then Bingham's famous first draft, the Congress shall have the power to make all laws necessary and proper to secure to all persons in every state equal protection in their rights of life, liberty, and property. It's so striking that equal protection and life, liberty, and property are melded together. So when we look at the final text of the 14th Amendment, what can your work and research tell us about the degree to which it was drawing on those antebellum principles?
Well, one of the things that I started thinking about a lot, and if you look at Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, you see that there are two different main ways that people are referred to in that. One is as citizens and one is as persons. And, there's been a lot of commentary on that. It says, no state can deny to citizens the privileges or immunities of citizenship, but it also says that no state can deny persons due process of law and equal protection of law. And so I was really had both of those concepts, citizens and persons, in mind as I went back and looked at the antebellum conversations. And one of the ways of thinking about it is, so the framers of the 14th Amendment, as we know, drew on constitutional language that they were familiar with, because they didn't want to they weren't inventing it out of whole cloth. They were thinking, what are the existing principles that we're already aware of that we can kind of tweak and put into a new light when we craft this new amendment. And so where personhood comes in is, if you look at the original Bill of Rights, for example, the rights in the Fifth Amendment to due process are sort of promised to persons. There's not a discussion of citizenship when you look at those original bill, the first 8 amendments or so of the Constitution. So there's already a precedent in the United States for promising rights to persons. Now we know that, or at least it's really important to understand that until the 14th Amendment, the rights promised to people in the Bill of Rights were only guaranteed against interference by the federal government and not by the states. And so, the central thing that the 14th Amendment does with respect to the Bill of Rights is it indicates that now the federal government will have the power to protect persons in those similar kind of rights. There's a debate about how many of the Bill of Rights were incorporated and so on, but that the federal government has the power to protect persons in those rights that are discussed in the Bill of Rights. Meanwhile, at the same time, there's a discussion of citizenship in the original Constitution in the Privileges and Immunities Clause, Article 4, Section 2. And that clause is also very much on the table and up for debate during the antebellum period. And so a lot of times when people are making reference to citizens' rights before the Civil War, they're often, if they want to elevate their claims up to the federal level, they're often talking about it in terms of the Privileges and Immunities Clause in the original Constitution. Now, a lot of times that has to do with state citizenship, which is a kind of concept that we don't think about that much anymore, like the concept of, I'm a citizen of Massachusetts, so I should be allowed to travel freely within the United States. I'm a citizen of Illinois. Now, in the post-14th Amendment world, we tend to think of citizenship only as a kind of national status. But before and until the Civil War, citizenship was often talked about as a state level status. And one of the key questions was the right to travel across state lines and do business and kind of conduct your life in a kind of interstate way. So those are two examples of how in the pre-Civil War period, these constitutional ideas about the rights of personhood and the rights of citizenship are very much on the table. I think I kind of left out that one of the central ways that they're debated is this question of racial equality. So in those areas, whether it is personhood or citizenship, were African Americans entitled to the same basic rights as white people? Many, many, many antebellum Americans believed they were not. And so part of the struggle, which seems to us so surprising in a way, is that it was actually really, really hard to persuade even white Northerners that having laws that explicitly discriminated against free African Americans was unacceptable. And this was the agenda that the movement that I'm talking about in my book pursued, was to argue that it is unacceptable to have racially discriminatory laws in a free society.
It's just fascinating. You said so much, and it was really meaningful that you called our attention to the Article 4, Section 2, the Privileges and Immunities Clause. And this is getting into the weeds a bit, but I know you can unpack it to help our friends understand it, because it's technical but significant. There was this theory among some abolitionists, the ellipsis theory, that this Section 2 of Article 4 should be read as if it said, the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States in the several states, inserting the words of the United States, suggesting there are certain privileges and immunities of United States citizenship, including the right not to be discriminated against on the basis of race with regard to fundamental rights, and that the 14th Amendment was just necessary to clarify that. The best way to probably bring this to life for our friends who are new to it is through stories. Are there stories in your book of people who, fought for this vision of privileges or immunities or equal civil rights, and how can you kind of help us understand the stakes in the debate as it unfolds?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to give a story. So there's some aspects of the book that talk about people within the states, but I'm going to talk, because when the U.S. Constitution is involved, it's often about issues related to travel or issues related to interstate issues. So in my book, I write a fair amount about the question of African American sailors. Now, there were a lot of Black sailors who lived in Massachusetts and New York. These were Atlantic seaboard states where there was a big intra-coastal trade. So African American men worked on ships that would take goods across, down the Atlantic coast and put in at ports in places like Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia, do their business in those ports, pick up stuff, bring them north. And so there's a thriving interstate trade, and there are a lot of African-American sailors. In fact, it was a very good job for African-American men at the time, in a kind of discriminatory labor market. Well, in a place like New York or Massachusetts, there were not very many racially discriminatory laws. Those states actually considered African Americans to be citizens of their states. Meanwhile, in, let's say, South Carolina, because it became the biggest example, from the 1820s onwards, the state of South Carolina passed laws that said that free Black sailors, when they came into the ports, would have to spend their time in jail. Basically, that Charleston authorities would come on board ships, escort Black sailors to jail. They would have to spend the time that they were in the port in jail. And then at the end of that time, the shipmaster would have to come, pick them up, pay the fees associated with the incarceration of these sailors, and then they could sail out of the port. So this was an obvious denial of the personal liberty of these sailors, right? And they had done nothing wrong. And the reason why a place like South Carolina had these laws was because they were afraid of Black sailors. They were afraid that worldly men who knew about freedom and knew about equality would come into the ports and start talking to local African Americans, and that they could be agents of slave insurrection, right? So they wanted to keep those people under wraps. In Massachusetts, a movement arose to make sure those men were safe, but also get somebody to do something about these South Carolina laws. And the argument that they made was the Privileges and Immunities Clause of Article 4, Section 2 said, these are citizens of the state of Massachusetts. They are entitled to the rights of citizens in other states. They are entitled to come and go freely from South Carolina or Louisiana, and they shouldn't be subjected to this kind of treatment. Now, in the pre-Civil War United States, it was actually really hard to make that argument. South Carolina was considered to be within its rights to make those laws by most people, by kind of federal courts. Although there was actually, I won't get too deeply into it, but so the people from Massachusetts who were involved in this movement end up appealing to the United States Congress to try to get Congress to do something about what South Carolina is doing. They try to get a case into federal court to get the federal courts to weigh in on this. They don't succeed in doing that. And so that's an example of trying to mobilize this section in the original Constitution to protect the rights of free African Americans and the limitations of that constitutional order. And so just to kind of put the 14th Amendment in perspective, the 14th Amendment explicitly says that citizens are entitled to the privileges and immunities of citizenship, and it gives Congress in Section 5 the power to enforce, right? And so before the 14th Amendment, there was a doubt, there were always questions about like whether Congress could actually tell South Carolina that that kind of law was unconstitutional. Now, with the 14th Amendment, Congress has the power to enforce these rights of the privileges and immunities of citizenship, the rights to equal protection and due process of law.
Thank you so much. Such a fascinating story. Those stories of the African-American sailors perfectly encapsulate free citizens who are denied basic rights in the antebellum era. And as you just explained to us, although that original Constitution arguably protected those rights, we needed the 14th Amendment to make it clear that there were certain basic rights of citizenship that all are entitled to without racial discrimination, and that Congress had the power to enforce that. Fascinating. Thank you so much. All right, well, the Q&A box is full of wonderful questions, and Mia Tolles has two involving gender. Are we able to apply the idea of equal rights to women through the Privileges and Immunities Clause, and do we need an Equal Rights Amendment given the 14th Amendment?
So should I go ahead and talk about that?
That would be great.
Yeah, so, ever since the 14th Amendment was ratified, right from the beginning, women in particular argued that the 14th Amendment also included women and that it gave women certain kinds of rights. And so one famous case is the case of Myra Bradwell, who was a lawyer who had trained in law, published a legal journal in Chicago, and wanted to become a member of the Illinois Bar. And so she and the Illinois Bar said, well, we don't accept women as lawyers. Women can't be lawyers. And so she took her case all the way up to the Supreme Court, arguing that as a citizen of the United States, one of the privileges and immunities of citizenship of the United States would be the ability to practice law or pursue your profession. And that should apply to women as well as to men or across racial lines and what have you. The Supreme Court said no. That the ability to pursue a profession or pursue a particular line of work was not among the privileges and immunities of citizenship in general, and then kind of like said, too bad Myra Bradwell. And there's a part of the opinion where I'm forgetting now which justice it is, goes into detail about, and then this was sort of over the top, unnecessary part of the opinion, but goes into detail about how we just can't have women lawyers. Women really need to be at home and take care of their families. And if we start to have women lawyers here and there, and who knows what else women are going to want to do, in the end, it's going to be totally disruptive to our family systems and so on. And so even though the basic part of the decision was there's not a guarantee to pursue a profession, in the Privileges and Immunities Clause, there's further kind of cultural assumptions about women, what women were supposed to be doing. And so, it took a very long time, and I see RBG referenced in the chat as well. I mean, it took until the late 1960s, early 70s, until people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg launched a campaign to kind of argue that the 14th Amendment also should be applied to sex discrimination, that notions of equal protection and due process in the 14th Amendment should also be applied to women, or in the case of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of course, to men as well, that neither men nor women should be discriminated against or have special privileges based on sex. And so the 14th Amendment opened the door to those claims, but those claims were not successful in court until much, much later. Thank you. Yeah, Justice Bradley, thank you for that Bradwell decision.
Thanks for that great answer, which also addresses Jeff Wickerson's question in the Q&A box. Any comment on Section 2 of the 14th Amendment where it says denied to any of the male inhabitants? The first time gender is introduced, does that get used against women as citizens? And yes, indeed, Jeff, as Professor Masur just explained so well, it's really a very limited notion of what privileges or immunities are at the time of the 14th, and they include basic civil rights like the right to make contracts, but not necessarily the right to be a lawyer, which isn't considered a civil right, and not voting rights. And that's why it took the heroic advocacy of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice Ginsburg, to argue that all laws that classify on the basis of gender, political or otherwise, have to be looked at skeptically. So that's completely great. We have a question from Lois Coate in both the 13th and 14th Amendment, the exception. There are a bunch of questions about the 13th Amendment criminal exception. The exception is commission of a crime. This was not intended as racially discriminatory, but was immediately used against Black people as Jim Crow laws developed. Was this exception ever addressed as needing rewarding to give redress for the near centuries discriminatory practices it led to?
Yeah, so this is a question that a lot of this kind of question about the 13th Amendment loophole is a question that a lot of people are asking, and it's been very much in the news. And the very effective film 13th made this point about the loophole. So the language that says, you can't be forced to labor or involuntary servitude except in the case of punishment for a crime was actually drawn from much earlier language. It's in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which outlawed slavery in the Northwest Territory, but also said slavery and involuntary servitude are prohibited except in the case of after you've been convicted of a crime. It's in a number of other state level laws and constitutions. And so the first thing I just want to note in this is that it was widely accepted at the time in the late 18th century and into the 19th century that if you were convicted of a crime, you could be forced to labor. And that was accepted not only in slaveholding societies or in societies that endorsed slavery, race-based slavery, but also in the free North. And so I think I would, sort of make the point that the history of that type of clause is not necessarily a history that's directly tied to slavery or the abolition of slavery. I also would kind of make the point that convict labor and the kind of coercive labor practices associated with the post-Civil War South would have happened regardless of the 13th Amendment loophole. These were practices that were put in place at the state level that were not litigated as 13th Amendment issues. They weren't considered. And so I think the notion that but for that loophole, we would not have had mass incarceration, we would not have had convict leasing or kind of exploitation of imprisoned laborers in the late 19th century South is not really the case. And it's not really the 13th Amendment's fault that we ended up with that. The forces are much more complicated and they're much more, and I don't think a more cleanly worded 13th Amendment would necessarily have stopped that from happening, because there's so many ways in which incarcerated people are denied all kinds of rights, right? Are not really considered in so many ways to have the same kinds of rights as people who live outside of that system. And so, so that being said, it's there. It's a kind of archaic language by the time that the 13th Amendment was passed. It was language that Charles Sumner apparently is the only person who was on record in Congress arguing against it. But it was almost, as I said before, these framers of the amendments were interested in kind of putting them in constitutional traditions that already existed. So in a way, what they're doing is it's kind of a backward looking gesture to like, yes, we've already had these kind of exceptions for people convicted of crimes. We're going to keep that in here. And so that's what I see that they're doing. And I actually really don't see it as a kind of secret conspiracy to end up, essentially re-enslaving people. I think that's not what the Republicans who passed these measures had in mind, although it is certainly the case that the criminal justice or injustice system and all kinds of other measures were used after the Civil War, particularly in the South, to discriminate and repress and kind of inflict very cruel and unfair treatment on African Americans in particular.
That's such a important answer, and as you say, although the exception was not the source of all of the undermining of Reconstruction that followed, it did authorize Southern states or give them an excuse to criminalize low-level offenses and then impose draconian punishments like convict labor. And it also helped encourage the Black Codes, which denied African Americans certain basic civil rights. That led to the passage of the 14th Amendment to give Congress the power to pass the Civil Rights Act, which leads to Victoria Williams' question: how, after the 14th Amendment, were Southern states able to effectively pass the Jim Crow laws that basically skirted around the 14th Amendment?
Right. So one of the ironies or kind of, really sad things really about American history is that the Reconstruction period gave us the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which today are the foundation of so many individual rights in this country, are so important to, our right to vote, our rights to marry, our rights to, kind of basic liberties. But they went unenforced, particularly the 14th and 15th Amendments, for almost 100 years, or like in many respects. And so one of the most important developments about the 14th Amendment is that it said states can't deny people due process or equal protection of the laws, which many of the Republicans who supported the amendment believed that laws could not be racially discriminatory. And that included laws in their minds at the time that separated people, that claimed to sort of racial segregation laws. But over time, the courts accepted that this principle that separate could be equal. So probably people in the audience know about the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896, famously said, okay to separate but equal. But part of what I think an important insight about that is that part but equal is basically saying they're conforming to the equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment. So this, what develops, particularly in the 1880s and 1890s, is this idea that we're not violating equal protection by providing separate facilities. We're going to provide racially separate facilities, but that's still equal protection of the laws. You're just in different spaces, right? Now, many people, Black people and white people, could see through these excuses, right? Could see that this is not about equality. This is about discrimination. The facilities provided for African Americans were not equal to the facilities provided for white people. The premise of the entire idea of racial segregation was an idea that races should be separate, that some races were better than others. But from a legal and kind of constitutional perspective, by the end of the 19th century, courts were largely accepting this idea that separate facilities did not violate equal protection. And that is why, the Brown versus Board of Education decision, for so many reasons, was so important. But one of the primary reasons is it rejects that idea, right? It says you are not complying with equal protection if you provide separate facilities, even if you argue that those facilities are equal.
We talked about Brown earlier this week, and here's a basic question, of course, involving original understanding in Brown. Would the framers of the 14th Amendment believe that laws passed with the intent of stigmatizing and degrading, laws that were caste affirming, violated the 14th Amendment? Or is that a more modern notion that is not rooted in the original understanding?
I mean, when you put it that way, laws that are degrading, laws that are caste affirming, no, they would not. That is what they were fighting against. And that is that's a lot of what I'm talking about in the book, is that there's actually a tradition in the North of making these arguments that these laws are insulting, that they are degrading, that they're discriminatory in intent. And so the goal was to make those laws illegal and unenforceable. That's what they were trying to do.
And in that sense, I'll just ask, because we had such a lively discussion about it, do you believe that Brown is consistent with the original understanding of the 14th Amendment or not? I
think it's a complicated question, and my first book that I wrote was on Washington, D.C. I'm very familiar with the fact that, Congress, the same Congresses that passed the 14th Amendment, also essentially ratified by funding and kind of creating a framework for segregated schools in the District of Columbia. So they did not say, oh, we're passing the 14th Amendment, therefore we have to have desegregated or integrated schools in DC. That's a fact. That's a fact of history. Did some of these Republicans who passed the amendment believe that racial segregation in schools was morally wrong, was unacceptable? Yes. Charles Sumner is a great example. Thaddeus Stevens. So you kind of take the people on the kind of more progressive side. They believed that every kind of racial discrimination in public policy should be struck down. But of course, there were plenty of people who also accepted segregation in schools, who in a context, and this is what I think is partially really important. The context is also that in the South, in Washington, D.C., there was virtually no public education for anyone before the Civil War. And so the notion that you would have the establishment of a public education system that educated white children and Black children, whether it's in the District of Columbia or in many Southern states, that was incredibly progressive at that time. Some people also said, yeah, and we also shouldn't have separate schools, but public school development was at such a kind of earlier stage of formation that even the fact of having public education was relatively new in many parts of the country. So I have recently gone back to the Brown versus Board of Education decision too. And, I really appreciate what the court says there about the significance of public education in American life in, 1954 or in the post-World War II period, right? And so we have to understand change over time, right? That what was kind of normal as people looked around the world at one point becomes not acceptable at a different point. And that is part of what the court also recognizes in that decision.
Completely fascinating. Thank you so much for that. Friends, we'll put in the chat box Professor Masur's, the book she just referenced, An Example for All the Land, Emancipation and the Struggle Over Equality in Washington, D.C., where you can learn more. Well, we need to wrap up in a moment, but I am going to ask one last question, and I know Curry will as well. In the chat, we have a question asking for more stories. Peter Schulman says, I'd love a lesson outline guidance on a series of distinct 14th Amendment stories to bring out the scope of its impact. The story of the African-American sailors was so powerful. Do you want to leave us with another sort of galvanizing, paradigmatic story that gave rise to the 13th, 14th, or 15th Amendment?
Wow, let's see. I'll give another, I'll take the invitation to give another example from my book, which is, I'm really interested in where the ideas came from. And so, and I think this is helpful for in some ways, thinking about politics in general and how politics works. The Midwestern states, when they came into the Union, so Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, mainly, these lower Midwestern states all had racially discriminatory laws on the books. And if you think about it, these states had, the percentage of African Americans living in these states was like 1% to 2%. So the Black people are a very small minority of the population. If in that situation, if you want your state to get rid of those racist laws, what do you do? Right? And Ohio did more and was more successful, people in Ohio, than in any other state in getting rid of those laws. And so what we see from, especially in the 1830s and 1840s, is a movement of people, African Americans who were politically active and white people who identified with the anti-slavery movement, start coming together. They start petitioning the legislature. They start saying these laws are wrong. We need to get rid of them. They start trying to gather political allies. They talk to the two major parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, and they say, hey, how can we get rid of these laws? These laws are wrong. At that point, neither party was particularly sympathetic to the idea. Some of them form a third party movement to try to disrupt politics and try to get their issues on the agenda. Long story short, what ends up happening with the development of this third party movement is in 1849, between sympathetic Whigs and Democrats and these third party people, the state legislature repeals most of those laws. And speaking of education, where Black children had been excluded from public education in Ohio, now they get their share as taxpayers of public education funding. So the schools that were established in 1849 were separate schools, but at the very least, now Black children have access to public education. And so, that's an example. So this fight, right, to kind of make the argument and get it into the state legislature that we don't want these anti-Black laws, we don't want these laws that deny African Americans even their most basic civil rights. This actually succeeds mostly in Ohio. And many of the more prominent members of the Lincoln administration during the Civil War, people who continue to press for policies about racial equality, were there at that time. Salmon Chase is an important one, later Supreme Court Chief Justice, Edwin Stanton. And so you really see Black activists who later become important figures in politics, like William Howard Day. And so you really see the development of this movement over the long term. And I would sort of take from that that when we're involved in politics ourselves and trying to kind of fight for things that we're interested in, that we want to see happen, that these things take time, and that this was a kind of struggle that happened over many generations, and that, you know, every little win or loss is not necessarily going to tell you what the big picture is going to look like.
Such an important lesson from that galvanizing story. And so consistent with the wisdom of Justice Ginsburg, too, who always would say that the job of courts is not to measure the passions of the moment, but the sentiments of the hour, and that it really, constitutional change, as you say, and as your path-breaking work shows, takes place over many decades and requires activism and engagement from citizens of all backgrounds in order to change our understanding of the Constitution. Curry, any final thoughts before we sign off?
One question, and it was the first question of the class from Angelo. So Angelo's question was, how did they pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment? You know, grappling in our students' heads with knowing that these were big changes to the Constitution, how did they actually get the Southern states to ratify them? And, you know, how much of a huge accomplishment was this? Because sometimes we look at Reconstruction and only focus on what didn't work, but this is huge, game changing. So real simply, how did they get the Southern states to pass it? And then what kind of moment is this in our time? And this was the easiest class I've ever had to do. So thank you, students, for being so hot in the Q&A box.
Yeah, so literally, how did they get these amendments ratified? Each amendment has a different answer. So, and it could be, you know, a whole hour's worth of discussion. So I'll try to keep it really brief. With the 13th Amendment, which was ratified during 1865, and as you know, you probably know if you're studying Reconstruction, this was called presidential Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson was determining Reconstruction policy, and Johnson actually urged the Southern states to ratify the 13th Amendment so that they could kind of come back into the Union and kind of show that they were accepting the consequences of the Civil War, which was the end of slavery. When I say the Southern states, the people who were in charge of the Southern states when Johnson was during 1865 were white Southerners, some of whom had been pardoned by Johnson, some of whom had been Confederate leaders. And so he's basically saying to these white Southerners who are more or less kind of allies of his, you know, just please ratify this and so we can get on with things. And we all know that slavery is kind of demolished by the war anyway, we're not going back, so go ahead and ratify. So that's the kind of story of ratification. I believe most of the ex-Confederate states ratified the 13th Amendment, although some did not. When you get to the 14th Amendment, by the time that's out for ratification in 1866 through some of 1868, it's a more complicated question. And what ends up happening, and this, if you go back to the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, so by the time of 1867, ratification on the 14th Amendment has stalled. And you're right, you know, to ask, like, these Southern states that are working under Johnson's policy of Reconstruction absolutely don't want to ratify the 14th Amendment. Congress passes the Reconstruction Acts in 1867 and basically says, okay, we're reorganizing Reconstruction now. We're taking it out of the hands of the president. We're putting it in the hands of Congress. And if you want back into the Union, you're going to have to rewrite your constitutions, you're going to have to enfranchise African-American men, and you're going to have to ratify the 14th Amendment. And so it becomes a condition of readmission of the states. And so that's how a lot of the Southern states end up ratifying the 14th Amendment, is because it's a condition of coming back into the Union.
Wonderful. Thank you. We knew that was a hard question, but it really does kind of help you understand how the pieces are at play and what is going on socially, politically, and constitutionally. So I want to thank you so much. This was such a great Friday class, and really understanding what we talk about, that the civil rights movement isn't just 1960s, that there's a civil rights movement going on from the revolution to modern time, and that we should understand why we look for that and how our union always becomes more perfect. So thank you so much for joining us today. Jeff, what a great way to go out on this week's of class. I love when the students have a million questions. And thank you all very much. Next week is Thanksgiving break, students. We will see you the following week when we talk about Congress, and maybe we'll dive really deep into the powers of Congress on the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and how they use it during that time. Thank you all very much, and see you next time in class.
Thanks, Professor Masur. Have
Thanks
a wonderful Thanksgiving, everyone, and we'll see you next.
Same to you all.
Thanks.
It was great to be here. Okay,
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Bye.